Hello and welcome. My name is Cheryl Miller and I'm an independent Stampin' Up! Demonstrator in Australia. This video is created for the September Creating Kindness Design Team video hop. The theme is circles and I have created a fun, whimsical card using the circle element for flowers. Links to the other videos in the hop are included in the video description below. All products used for this project are from Stampin' Up! The circles are die cut with the Layering Circles framelits, and the Touches of Texture stamp set is used for the floral elements. And for colouring I'm using Pool Party and Bermuda Bay Stampin' Blends. Let's get the die cutting out of the road first and bring in the big shot. I'll be using the two smallest circle dies from the Layering Circles framelits. I'm using the magnetic plate and two clear cutting plates. I've got a 10.5 by 15 centimetre piece of Whisper White thick cardstock. It seems like a large piece of card, but you'll see why later on. So position the two dies on the card and run through the big shot. While I have the big shot out, let's cut the designer series paper. I'm using a new die set from the holiday catalogue, which is called In the Woods Framelits dies. Specifically this long curved die, which I'm going to use to create a garden bed for my flowers. The designer series paper is this spotty design in Coastal Cabana. This paper comes from the Brights 6x6 designer series paper collection. There is a set for each colour collection and they are on page 191 of the annual catalogue right down the bottom. There are 40 sheets in a pack and two different double-sided designs, 2 spots and 2 stripes. I've cut this Coastal Cabana sheet to 10.5 centimetres, which is the width of my card front. I'm placing the die across the card so that the highest bit sits at about 6 centimetres or 2.5 inches up from the bottom. So that will give me the smaller piece, which will be my garden bed. And I'll also use the remaining piece to cut a small strip for the inside of the card. So to do that, I'll simply cut off the remaining curve from the leftover piece with the paper trimmer. Now, while we have these two pieces out, I'm going to sponge the top curved edges with Coastal Cabana ink. I'm using a stamping sponge, but you could also use a sponge dauber. And you're aiming for a soft, feathered shadow effect on both pieces. So you can see I'm starting off the card and just pulling the ink onto the very edge of the curved piece, and repeat this for the second piece of card. Now I'll set both these pieces aside while I colour up the circular die cuts. So I have here the light and dark Pool Party Stampin' Blends and the light Bermuda Bay Stampin' Blend. I'll start off with the light Pool Party blend and use the brush end to colour the entire circle, working in a semicircular motion. So you can see I have the brush end of the marker laid on its side rather than bending up the flexible tip, and I'm just basically laying down a base of colour to work into. Next up is the dark Pool Party, and I'm adding a darker area to the bottom 2/3 of the circle, leaving a light highlight at the top. Now I'm blending the two colours together with the light Pool Party Stampin' Blend. So the next colour is the light Bermuda Bay, and I'm going to apply some colour just to the bottom third, again in that semicircular motion. Now this is quite dark, but if I come in with the dark Pool Party, I can blend that edge into the Pool Party colour, and again always finish off with that light colour just to reblend those edges. Now this is getting quite saturated with ink. You can see it's come through to the back, and I've got a couple of little lines on the circle, so I'm going to come back in again and lay down another layer of colour, starting with the dark Bermuda Bay, blending it in with the dark Pool Party, and then once again finishing off with the light Pool Party just at the top for that highlight area. So this is saturating this circle again, and it's much easier for the ink to move on the saturated cardstock and blend. So I'm going to repeat this process for the large circle. I'm going to put you on quite fast forward to move through this piece, and a little bit of blending music might help. And I'm back again, and now we have our two little spheres. Don't they look great? They're still quite wet, so the colours will continue to blend until they're dry. I don't want to stamp on them until they are dry, so let's move on and set up the front of the card. I'm going to use the Stamparatus to stamp my images because they are rubber and I want to line them up perfectly. The images are the stem and the fluffy flower texture image from the Touches of Texture stamp set. I won't need the black foam mat because we're using rubber stamps, however I will need my polypropylene imaging sheet, but you can use whatever method you use to position your rubber stamps on the Stamparatus. Make sure the poly sheet is butted up firmly into the corner where the two Stamparatus hinges meet, and pick up the stamp with the stamping plate. I'm going to use Granny Apple Green to stamp the image onto the card, but to stamp the index image onto the poly sheet, I'll use Memento black ink. So ink up the stamp and stamp down onto the poly sheet, and then clean the black ink off the stamp with the Stampin' Chamois, ensuring that you don't move the stamp on the plate or you'll just wreck the whole positioning thing we've just done. And now you know that the stamp is going to stamp in the same place each time. You'll need to position the spotty paper onto the card front to determine where to stamp the stems. Keeping the poly sheet butted into the corner of the Stamparatus, place the card under the sheet and then move it around until the stem is positioned where you want to stamp it. Bend up the poly sheet, remove the Designer Series paper and place the magnet onto the card to hold it firm. So you can see that's going to stamp there. Now remove the poly sheet, ink up the stamp with Granny Apple Green ink and stamp in place. Now to stamp the second stem, bring the poly sheet back in, butt it up into the corner and move that card around with the Designer Series paper in place until the second stem is positioned where you want it. Again, remove the paper, hold the card in place with the magnet, remove the poly sheet, ink the stamp up again and stamp the second stem. And voila! Two stems stamped exactly in place. So let's glue the Designer Series paper in place on the card front before we stamp the greeting so we can tell exactly where we need to put the greeting. I'm using multi-purpose liquid glue, which I can tap into place on the card front so that no white edges show. And then I can trim off any excess paper with my paper snips. So that fits exactly in place, and I've got a little bit of excess here, which I'll just quickly snip off. And now I'll use the Stamparatus to stamp the greeting onto the card front. So I'll need a stamping plate and also the poly sheet. The greeting Happy Birthday comes from the stamp set Botanical Bliss, which is in the annual catalogue. It's also a rubber stamp set and I haven't put the index image on it, so it can be difficult to get exactly straight on the card. I'm using the grid on the Stamparatus to try and get this image as straight as I can, placing it face down, picking it up with the stamping plate. Ensure the poly sheet is firmly butted up into the corner of the Stamparatus, and this is essential to have the image stamp in the same place every time. Again, I'll stamp the index image onto the poly sheet with black Memento ink, and you can see that it has stamped slightly off kilter on the grid, so it would have been crooked on the card front. Not the end of the world, but if I can get it straight, that makes me happy. So place the card front under the poly sheet, holding the sheet in place so that the corner is firmly butted up. I think firmly butted up into the corner is my new mantra. And wriggle the card around until you're happy with placement of the greeting. Bend up the sheet, pop a magnet in place and remove the poly sheet. I'll need to remove the black ink from my stamp. It's important to make sure that the stamp does not move or all that positioning will not work. Then I'm going to ink up the stamp with Coastal Cabana ink and stamp the greeting in place onto the card. Ta-da! A perfectly placed greeting. All that's left to do now is to add the flowers to the stems. The two blended circles are now dry and we need to stamp the flower texture image from Touches of Texture over the top in Coastal Cabana ink. Now you could easily just use an acrylic block to stamp this image over the circles, however the rubber stamp is larger than the circles and I want to get that floral centre as close as I can to the centre of the circle. So I'll use the Stamparatus again. Now I have the poly sheet in place, butted up into the corner, and I have my stamp on the stamping plate. So I've stamped my index image using Memento black ink, which I'll clean off with my Stampin' Chamois, as I'm going to be using Coastal Cabana ink. So you can just place the circle in position under the poly sheet. However, there is nowhere to put the magnet to hold the image in place. This is where we use that piece of white cardstock we cut the circles out of earlier. So place the white card in place over the circle and bring the poly sheet back in to line up the stamp. Then you can place the magnet on the white card. The circle will sit in place in the cutout bit. Now it's easy to ink up the image with Coastal Cabana ink and stamp over the circle. So once you've stamped over the top, you'll see that the image stands out quite well, although that will fade back a little and be softer. Then repeat this process with the next circle. Place the white card, put the smaller circle in the cutout, and then move the whole thing around until the circle's positioned underneath the stamp correctly. The good thing about this is that if the circle moves, your white card's still in the same place, so you can just reposition that little circle inside the cutout and stamp down on top. So I've already adhered the designer series paper to the inside of the card, and now all that's left is to add our flowers to the stems. I'm using Stampin' Dimensionals to do that. The light source would normally come from above, so position the flower accordingly with the shadow at the bottom and the light area at the top. Then make sure that you position the second flower in the same orientation so that it sort of all looks a bit cohesive. And that's it, my quirky little circle card. I hope you enjoyed this video today. Please make sure you hop around to the other design team members' videos. Links are in the video description below. See you next time.